Welcome back to a little bit more on civil society in Africa. What you're looking at, in fact, is something which is vibrant and dynamic. By that I mean it's evolving into the future. And what I also mean is that it's been evolving for quite some time. It wasn't something that simply arrived on the scene with missionaries, with colonizers, and things of that nature. Obviously, there was an impetus to develop all kinds of mechanisms of social and indeed economic organization as a means of resisting or at least stating terms to both missionaries and colonizers. For instance, Wamba Dia Wamba and Mahmoud Mamdani both write about the dynamics of burial societies, credit savings societies, all kinds of things that were organized to allow the community to respond to the demands of increasingly modern life. Suddenly, burials, putting someone to rest, cost money. Suddenly, achieving credit worthiness meant either relying on banks that were owned by white colonizers or by setting up credit societies of your own. And the whole idea of being able also to express resistance in a more marked but satirical manner was accomplished by the most amazing means. Terence Ranger wrote about the advent of marching bands. These were bands inspired in part by the Salvation Army, which had a very early imprint and continues to have an imprint in many African countries. But the whole idea of marching in formation, playing wind instruments, trumpets, trombones, that kind of thing. But doing so in such a way that there was a deliberate aping, a deliberate mimicking in a satirical fashion of white people playing these instruments and taking tea afterwards. In terms of the popularity of these performances, what you had was an appreciation not only of the music, some very good music was produced in Salvation Army marching style, but also, of course, it was an amusement. It was, look, how funny, how silly the habits of these white people actually are. And of course, this is something that the white colonizers never actually realized was being done as a satire in their faces. This kind of informal civic association, for both reasons of satire, reasons of economic progress and solidarity, that developed from all kinds of antecedent organizational capacities well before the colonizers arrived. In other words, what you had to have in terms of your social unit having solidarity was a form of social organization. If you've got 2,000 different ethnic groups in Africa, what you had to have was some means of differentiating yourself from other groups and some means of articulating your sense of difference and articulating the importance of your form of social organization. Given that these 2,000 different ethnic groups comprised a whole range of different political organizations, from kingship societies through to more flatline headman societies, the differences could become quite significant. It provided, as it were, forms of cohesion. In other words, whether you had a headman or whether you had a king, that person had to rule over something that could be socially articulated, not simply something which obeyed commands. And the articulation of social cohesion, the articulation of social organization, laid the groundwork for what we would later call civil society. When the new states, after colonialism, started coming into being, many of them were fragile because not much had been put into them by way of political, infrastructural, and public administrative organization by the departing colonial powers. In some cases, certainly. In other cases, very, very little indeed. So you had a fragile new sense of statehood. And at the same time, you had often quite strong forms of internal component parts to that new state. In Zambia, for instance, if you go now, it's an annual ceremony open to tourists, very spectacular, the annual Komboka ceremony, when the floodplains of the western part of the country come into full flood, and the Lutunga, or the king of the Lozi people, has to shift his palace to higher, drier land. He does so in a huge ceremonial armada of boats and barges. And he's dressed in, wait for this, a British admiral's uniform. And the performance of the ceremony is a recreation of the past. They've always had a Komboka ceremony, and an appropriation in satirical form, just like the marching bands, of the way the British used to appear to them. Well, I must have an admiral's uniform, mustn't I? But he's a Lutunga, he's a king. Because it was a kingship society, the British tried to make, as it were, a special deal with an articulated form of political organization. And so they promised the Lutunga that when independence came, there would be special consideration for the Lozi people, perhaps even a state of their own. Now, in fact, a state of their own was never going to be viable. It was going to be landlocked. It was not going to have resources. It would be totally dependent on the surrounding area. So it became independent as part of Zambia. But to this day, what you continue to have, is a sense of delinquent nationalism, or the same, on the part of the Lozi people. They were somehow special in the realm of colonization. In the face of these different forms of identity, only modern civil society, which incorporates aspects of traditional organization, holds the nation together. And if it's hard enough in a country like Zambia, this is one of the great accomplishments of Kenneth Kaunda. He actually made it work. It's not been as successful in many European states. When, as I said, you had the era of the Cold War and communism swept over much of Europe, what you had was the advent of the single-party state trying to dominate the space that civil society once had. So that when independence from Soviet domination, hegemony, oversight, rule finally came, what you had was a struggle to try to establish the ingredients of a cohesive new independent nation state. And even those states that had been foremost in resisting Soviet rule, such as Czechoslovakia, for instance, the famous Prague Spring of protest against the Gauleiters of the Soviet Union, local, as it were, placemen who ruled in the name of Moscow. What you had was therefore an achievement which was startling in terms of the solidarity that resisted Soviet encroachment and Soviet domination, but you also had a lack of preparation for what independent statehood would mean in terms of social cohesion. So what you have now is, of course, two separate states. It's no longer Czechoslovakia. It was what they called a velvet divorce, following upon their peaceful velvet revolution that sought to cast off Soviet domination. And now you have Slovakia and you have the Czech Republic, whereas they cohered very well together underneath one-party state, Soviet-dominated rule. So civil society has got to be strong enough to emulate that which sought to take its place, did take its place, and became stronger than any kind of alternative that could be speedily put into place. So lesson one is that civil society is organic. You just can't invent it. It has to develop, it has to have cohesion, it has to have willingness of buy-in. And of course, this didn't work in the face of ethnic difficulties, and one of the great catastrophes of 20th century Europe, and that's the fragmentation of Yugoslavia into its present component parts, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, where ethnic divisions still tear that country apart, Kosovo, still great difficulties there, etc., Montenegro. And you have, as it were, unfinished business in terms of articulating the legacy of the past into a modern, separated future, demanding local, separate forms of political organization and civil organization. So a degree of reinvented chauvinism from the past starts to creep into the equation. We've always been like this, whereas in fact we weren't. This is an invention for modern purposes. So civil society becomes something which struggles with the past, tries to incorporate the past, tries to take the past into the future, knowing all the while that the future is going to change the past. Now, this happens in Europe, where, of course, in those countries of which I spoke, for instance, we used to call the language Serbo-Croat. They're now two separate official languages, thank you very much, although the differences between them, apart from the written form, one in Cyrillic alphabet, one in Roman alphabet, but the spoken form is really no different to the different dialects of English that you're going to get in a world city like London, for instance. And certainly no different to English as spoke in Glasgow and spoke in Birmingham. So you have, as it were, an invention in which civil society and new cultural organizations play a major part. Now, what you have with states in Africa, which are not very old in terms of their modern adhesion to the international state system, which in itself is not very old, having started early in 1648 and taken some time to gain traction in the world of states that we now recognize. You have, as I said, in terms of Jan Patočka, the Czech philosopher's writings, a universe of the shaken which requires a solidarity of the shaken. The shaken is one step better than the unsettled, and the unsettled is one step better than the disintegrating. But even in terms of what is regarded as settled, what you have are all kinds of difficulties in what a citizen of an African state must face. And I tried to outline some of this in a short book I wrote called Composing Africa. Can you see this in the sunlight? I'm not sure you can. Try this again. No, you can't see this. But anyway, this was written as a rehearsal document. It's a short book published in Finland, and it was meant to be the dress rehearsal for a longer book, which in fact I never got around to writing. And curiously, it became, here we go, a little bit more, still not very, as it were, Composing Africa, Civil Society and its Discontents. It's in the library. And curiously, although it was never a finished work, it became the foundation for a PhD thesis at King's, much to my horror, because I had intended to articulate it much further. But at the end of this little book, I've listed a whole set of things that a citizen of Africa has got to confront and what civil society has got to confront in terms of providing an organized foundation for social and civic life for its citizens. So even in a settled society, that is one not shaken, not unsettled, not going to war and disintegrating, what you've still got in a settled society is the national political impact upon a citizen's life, national cohesion, national politics, certainly not always being reliably settled. You've got, secondly, the local political and administrative impact upon a citizen's life. We're facing, as it were, local body elections and by-elections in Zimbabwe in March, and the furore around political organization for that has certainly impacted upon the lives of citizens, precisely because of competing party organizations. So thirdly, the impact of political party organization, both nationally but also locally upon a citizen's life. Fourthly, the impact of formal economy upon a citizen's life. How, in the face of a failing economy, again taking Zimbabwe as an example, are you able to exist, feed your family, derive income, all of which has got to be derived reliably only from formal paid employment? How do you do this when jobs are scarce, when the government controls the public service and is apt to fire teachers, doctors, if they protest against the lack of decent working conditions? Fifthly, what you have for the impacted citizen is the cohesion of organization that must interact with international civil society, often funding agencies such as Oxfam, How do you relate to them while seeking their money, while not giving away your values, but trying often fruitlessly to express your values in terms of a value system that the funding organization would understand, but you need the funds. So that's a major difficulty, which, as I said, my PhD student in Botswana is working on right now. Of course, number 6, the impact of ethnicity upon a citizen's life. Are you Zambian? Are you Lozi? Are you Shona or are you Zimbabwean? Are you Xhosa or are you South African? Are you Yoruba or are you Nigerian? All of these questions continue to be asked. To which do you owe your affinity, your affiliation, and to which do you owe your loyalty and your patriotism? And this has a major impact in some of the, as it were, cultural beliefs associated with ethnic groups. Let us call them, for the sake of argument, magical, religious, or mythical beliefs, which inflamed the terrible civil war in Liberia, for instance. I've already referred people to Stephen Ellis's book, The Mask of Anarchy, about the terrible impact of malign spiritual beliefs and practices which inflamed and exacerbated and made terror-stricken the war in Liberia. Number 8, the web of religious practices, which often can be also part of a patron-client relationship. How do you transact what the priest tells you, what other patrons tell you? Again, if you're depending upon patrons for money, perhaps it's been stolen money, when you depend on the priest for validation, the baptism certificate for your child, for instance. All of these things mean that the citizen of Africa has got to transact relations with people who are dominant above him or her. And of course, the impact of the informal economy. When everything else fails, you've got to go into the informal market. You've got to hustle. You've got to sell goods on the roadside. You've got to repair tires on the roadside. Because even if you're an informal trader, even if you're an informal roadside mender of tires, you need the formal currency in order to survive. That transaction between the informal and the formal is something which is writ large in the lives of citizens all over Africa. And of course, number 10, the impact of violence. If there's no money, there's going to be thievery, there's going to be robbery, there's going to be violent, as it were, gang warfare. There's going to be a demand among those who are able to organize themselves violently to be able to dominate such economic life as is possible for them to dominate. So a competition between the elements of the informal, often violent, and a competition, again, sometimes violent, in terms of controlling the intersections between the informal and the formal. Now, when you put all of this together, the citizen of Africa, even before she begins to cohere as individuals into the communal sense of organization that we call civil society, already that citizen is up against it. Those people in metropolitan countries who study civil society invariably are studying civil society underneath settled conditions. And by settled, I mean conditions which are far more settled than what I would describe as settled in many African jurisdictions. The list I just gave you is what I would call a list in a settled society. They're all the same, cannot escape the volatilities of development, underdevelopment, emergence into forms of development in Africa. At the same time, as I said, the cohesion of Africa, the cohesion of African states is such that no one really thinks anymore of serious secession. It's always there as a political instrument to be rolled out, but in fact, the number of serious candidates for new statehood in Africa are very, very small. Somaliland for statehood, independent from Somalia, but that in fact follows colonial lines of demarcation in any case. And there's a form of not only settled civil society, but reasonably settled government in Somaliland, which is not often able to be said to be the case in Somalia. So you have, as it were, forms of cohesion within forms of statehood, which, if not settled, are at least accepted as your surrounding, as your, as it were, context in which you must develop civil society. And as I said, we've just recently had the Africa Cup of Nations. Nothing like football to bring a nation together. It sounds like a trivial thing to say, but when there's an Olympic triumph, when there's a footballing triumph, even when an African player makes it big in a Premiership team or a Serie A team, this is a cause for national rejoicing. It's a cause for a sense of unity. And in fact, it seems a trivial thing to say, but it's a serious thing to say. I've seen it with my own eyes. Something as seemingly anodyne and as trivial as football can, in wars. I've been among peacekeepers and they haul out their baggage. They're going to, as it were, set up camp between two rival opposing armies. And I look at what they're carrying. Oh, yes, they've got their ammunition, they've got their supplies, they've got all of that. And they've got a gigantic supply of footballs. And I'm thinking, what the hell is going on here? And the first thing they do is to invite both opposing armies to select a team of football players, and they play football. And the peace is kept while they have a football rivalry and develop forms of friendship which would not have been possible without it, and forms of cohesion which lend themselves to conflict resolution, which lend themselves to forms of social organization that bespeak a possible future unity. All of these things, anodyne, simplistic, trivial, go into making the everyday, which go into making the everyday African life, everyday civil, civic, social life, everyday national life in Africa possible. So thank you. Sorry about the sunlight, and hopefully see you in class after another week or so. Thank you.